Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel for another reading wrap up. No, I did not forget my promise at the beginning of this year where I told you I was bringing back reading wrap ups and reviews of what I read every month to my channel. But even though I said that, you may have noticed I didn't do one in February, and that's simply because life has been so busy. I haven't been reading as much of late, and it was also difficult to fit in filming everything I wanted to film. So I saved the books and I'm here to do a wrap up for February and March. So between those 2 months I have read 7 books, which seems like a fairly good amount to discuss in one video. It gives me a little bit of space to discuss them all, but also there's not too many to cover. But otherwise you pretty much know what to expect from these kind of videos. They are BookTube standard and some of my favourites to watch and film, so hopefully you'll enjoy this one. I did film 2 reading vlogs over the course of February and March in which I do discuss the books I read in greater detail because I am talking about them as I read them and my feelings at different points in the books. So those reading vlogs will be linked down below, and I will actually start by reviewing the books that I didn't read in reading vlogs so that they get their time to shine. So first up is actually the book I most recently finished. I literally finished this last night, and that is Gallant by V.E. Schwab. This is a proof copy, which is why it's a paperback, because it just came out in hardback. It is currently available to buy, and I am rarely this early on a book. Like, I have rarely read a book the month it comes out, sometimes, but it's not my norm, so I'm feeling very on trend with this one, and it's really fun to see everyone talking about it online because I feel like I'm part of the conversation, which maybe is a sign to read things as they come out more often. But yeah, this was actually my first ever V.E. Schwab book, or Victoria Schwab. I believe she uses different forms of her name depending on what age range she's writing for, and in this case we have a YA dark fantasy novel. V.E. Schwab is someone I've heard a lot of great things about for years now. People have been raving about her novels for all ages, and I've been meaning to read her. I've had friends recommend me books, I've even had friends lend me her books, but I just haven't managed until now, finally. So thank you to Titan for sending me this proof, because I did really enjoy it, and I think it's going to be a good jumping off point for me because it's a standalone novel, and it was a really excellent introduction, I think, to an author's writing because it is so well written. This book stood out to me in particular because of the writing. It feels very immersive, quite beautiful in its sort of darkness and eeriness, and really atmospheric. It's about a young girl named Olivia. She's 16 years old and she has grown up her entire life in an orphanage / boarding school for girls. She was abandoned there as a baby by her mother on the doorstep, and she has known nothing of her family or her parentage besides what is left in her mother's diary. So her mother left with her diary, so she's been able to read some of her mother's diary entries, but they make very little sense to an outsider. However, now at the age of 16, she has received a letter from her uncle inviting her to come to her family's ancestral home. Her uncle has supposedly been looking for her for years, for more than a decade, unaware of where she might be in the world, and finally has come across her. So of course she jumps at the chance. But when she arrives at Gallant, her ancestral home, her uncle's been dead for years, and she's not entirely sure who actually sent her this letter, and instead she's in this big house with her cousin, who is clearly quite ill and unhappy for her to be there, as well as the 2 servants who are almost like parents to her cousin. Now, besides the dark and mysterious, almost gothic elements we have there, we do have some paranormal aspects. Olivia can see ghouls, so what she describes as ghouls. They are somewhat like ghosts, although they don't communicate, and they are quite like PC. They're not entirely present, not all parts of them. And she's also lived her entire life unable to speak and uses sign language to communicate, although she's not deaf, so she can understand others when they speak to her, and that was really nice to see. Now, there is a bit of a paranormal reason for that, But regardless, in terms of disability representation, it's not something that's cured by magic throughout the narrative, which I think is really important when you see disabilities, whether they're in a fantastical or normal sense in these kind of books, because it's all too common that you see somebody with a disability who is then cured of that disability as part of the plot, as a sort of reward. And I really enjoyed that that didn't happen in this book. I love the gothic atmosphere. This one I feel is set in the sort of early 1900s. There's references to cars, like motor cars, but a specific date isn't actually given, and it's clearly not set in like the past few years. It's definitely more historical than that, but it's happening quite outside of reality. It doesn't feel entirely tied to the world we know. And like I said, I really enjoyed it. The way things ended did in some ways leave me feeling quite sad, but it wasn't a bad ending, and I'm definitely going to be reading more of V.E. Schwab in the future. So then the only other book that I read that wasn't part of a reading vlog was Ghosted in LA Volume 2. So this is a comic book series published by Boombox, which is hands down my favourite comic book publisher and imprint of a comic book publisher. Obviously I liked it enough to carry on. I read volumes 1 and was invested enough in the storyline and intrigued enough in the storyline to continue. I decided to pick up volume 2, and I was really hoping I was going to love it, because sometimes when I start a series I find the first volume kind of middling. I find there's elements I enjoy, but there's not enough meat for me to fall in love, and it takes a second volume for that love to really develop. However, that love didn't really develop during this second issue. I still think it's a solid comic book series, I say issue, volume, and I gave it 3 stars because it was good. I didn't dislike the reading experience, I enjoyed elements of it, but I'm still not invested enough, so at this point I don't want to carry on with the series. Like, I don't want to keep spending money on it or keep seeking it out or spending my time reading it when after 2 volumes I'm still not heavily invested. However, I do think there are going to be people out there that are going to adore it, so that's not necessarily me suggesting you don't give it a try, because it's not bad by any means. It's about a girl who has just completed high school in America, and she's gone off to college to be with her boyfriend. So she's picked her college based on her boyfriend, who she thinks she's in love with, and that they're going to have this fantastic time at college together. But when she gets there, he breaks up with her. So she is dumped as soon as she arrives, and she's in LA by herself with no friends, no family, no ties, at a university / college that she picked solely based on her partner. But she's in for a secondary surprise when she stumbles across this large LA type mansion inhabited by ghosts. So she meets these ghosts that live in this house, and she strikes a deal with them whereby she will help them do things that they can't do with a lack of physical form, and she will in exchange be able to spend time with them and hang out in this place and, you know, sort of make it her home and have this place to escape to. And I love that concept, and I also love the artwork. The artwork's stunning, but I cannot find it in myself to be invested in the characters. Like, I'm not in love with any of them, and I don't even mean because I don't like them. It's not that they're unlikable, and because I can become very invested in unlikable characters. That's not the issue. They're just characters who I forget about as soon as I look away from them and don't really have any, you know, feelings towards. And after 2 volumes of that, I'm just like not here for it. I feel like I should at least be invested in the protagonist, but I'm not. I do like that there are multiple forms of LGBTQ+ rep in this story. In fact, realistically, it should tick all my boxes. It should be the series that I love. But I just don't, and sometimes that happens, and that's okay. I'm just going to carry on with the comic book series that I do love, and I'm sure many other people will enjoy and carry on with this one because, you know, there's something for everybody. But those are the books I read that I didn't talk about in reading vlogs, so you won't have heard reviews of yet. But I did obviously read 5 more books, which I read in reading vlogs. So I'll talk about them in a little bit less detail, and if you want more in-depth thoughts, you can check out the review videos in the description box down below. Firstly, I read 3 books for a vlog in which I tried to read some of the books I had promised myself I would read before I turned 30. So I did in fact manage to read 3 of those books before I turned 30, as well as a few others which I'd already read, but I definitely came out of that TBR having read less of the books than I said I would. But hey ho, you never know how life is going to unfold. I am really happy I read those 3 books though, because if you watch that vlog you'll know I loved them all for one reason or another, and there was good reasons why I chose them to be on my TBR. The first of which is Flame of Seven Waters by Juliet Marillier. So this is book 6 in the Seven Waters series, which is a medieval fantasy series set in Ireland. It's a historical fantasy series which follows mortal characters but which the Fae have a role to play in. And it's also the final book, I can't remember if I said that already, which was quite emotional for me because this is one of my favourite series of all time. I fell head over heels for this series when I read Daughter of the Forest a few years back, and it really opened my eyes to Juliet Marillier as a writer and helped me fall in love with her work as a whole. So this series is not only one of my favourites of all time, it introduced me to one of my favourite authors of all time. So I have a lot of emotions tied up in it, and I was kind of scared to read the 6th book because when it comes to the last book in a series, it has a lot hanging on it, like there's a lot resting on its shoulders. You don't want it to disappoint, and thankfully this one did not. I really enjoyed it. Each book in this series follows a different lead female character from the same family over the course of a few different generations. So each story is a whole about one woman's life, but there are interweaving themes and prophecies, for example, which get played out over the course of those multiple generations. Naturally, I can't say too much about the storyline of this book because it is the final book in a 6-book long series, but it is about Maeve, who is one of the daughters of Seven Waters, who are this sort of more upper class family, I guess, if you consider there to be an upper class in the medieval era, but a wealthier family who own a lot of land, and her father is the chieftain of their area. She, however, has lived for more than a decade away from her parents with her aunt and uncle in Britain after she was involved in a serious accident which left her seriously injured and without the use of her hands. So she's another character who actually has a disability, and although Maeve's disability is not magically cured throughout this book, there is discussion of like physical therapy in a way that's befitting of like medieval language. So there are discussions in this book of her potentially having more use of her hands in the future, but it's not done in a magical way, it's done in a quite realistic physical therapy way, and she doesn't magically have her scarring healed from the fire she was in. So in general I think that's pretty good representation as well, but as somebody who doesn't have a physical disability, I'm not really the best person to speak on that. I did however enjoy that Juliet Marillier did have this wonderful, strong, well-rounded, endearing, believable, flawed, complex female lead who did have a disability. And all in all, I just really loved Maeve as a character. I do think that Juliet Marillier writes some of my favourite heroes and heroines of literature. They are always, like I said, like so complex and have these strengths, but they all take different forms. Like they're each very unique characters, and that's something I love about this series, the Seven Waters series, is that although we follow a new female lead in each book, they're not just repetitions of one another. They all feel like their own unique women with their own strengths and their own like complexities, and I love them. So yeah, this was an excellent closure to the series. I'm really sad it's over, but thankfully I do still have some other Juliet Marillier I haven't read before, and I can always go back and reread these books. For that same vlog, I read 2 non-fiction books, including Antigone Rising, The Subversive Power of Ancient Myths by Helen Morales. So Helen Morales is actually an author I'd read before in a more like academic context. I'd read more of her dense like academic work in the form of like essays and articles and books, but this is an accessible book written for pretty much anybody to read. You don't have to have any prior knowledge of myth, because it's about the way in which myth is subverted and reclaimed and reimagined and received by modern people in both good and bad ways, which is one of the things I really liked about this book. It looked at the way that, for example, like the texts of Hippocrates have been misused by dieting culture, which is really disturbing. I hadn't really encountered much of that. I mean, I've encountered a lot of diet culture, but I hadn't encountered much of their use of like Hippocrates and antiquity in the insidious nature of dieting culture, but also the way that like female singers and artists have used Greek mythology in their art in a really positive way, and just sort of like the ability for myth to become anything, and the way it's everywhere in our society, but also to like have like a critical approach to that. So like don't take for granted when somebody misuses myth in the way that, like I said, dieting culture does, but also see the adaptability and the beauty in myth. So there was like a lot packed into this book. And if anything, I wish it was longer, because I felt like it dealt with so much that it almost felt a little bit surface level, but that might just be because I am somebody who has read a lot about myth, mythical receptions, antiquity, and general non-fiction in this area. So although there were examples I'd never heard of, there were some that I was more familiar with, and I would have loved like more, like I just would have loved more. But that's not to say that this book necessarily needed to deliver that. It just means I need to seek out more and more in-depth texts, whereas this is such a great primer. This is such a great accessible book for anyone that's interested in reception studies, that's interested in mythology, that's interested in like feminism and modern political movements and the way they use the past. There's so much in here, and it was really, really interesting. I really like Helen Morales as a writer. I think she writes about things in a well-researched academic way that's still accessible and readable for a general audience, so that's fantastic. I then read In Black and White by Alexandra Wilson, the subtitle of which is A Young Barrister's Story of Race and Class in a Broken Justice System. And it is very much Alexandra Wilson's story. So Alexandra Wilson, at least when she wrote this book, was a newly qualified lawyer going through her early term in this field, so it's very much like her training years, her like first encounters with representing people in the court, about being on cases, rather than somebody who has had like a decades and decades long career and is looking back at it. It's quite fresh and it's quite recent and it's quite condensed into this short period. And I actually learned a lot about the UK justice system and UK laws and UK courts in the practical sense that I really enjoyed, because I feel like that's something we don't learn about just naturally. It's not something that we are offered up the information for in schools or through our general consumption of media. It's something that exists and we are assumed to know it exists, but actually very few of us understand the nitty-gritties of. I would love to read more books like this. I know there are the books by The Secret Barrister, which are written anonymously, that I'd like to check out, but if you have any other recommendations, do let me know, because otherwise a lot of the books I've read have been about more like US law, because there's so many of those out there. Alexandra Wilson pursued a career as a barrister after her cousin was murdered simply for being in the wrong place at the wrong time as a young black man. He was assumed to be a gang member because he was in an area with gang activity, but he wasn't, and he was stabbed and he was killed. And that was when her interest in the law began. And she does touch on a lot of the injustices and the lack of representation, both as a woman and as a black woman in the legal system, and the importance of representation and diversity in the background of lawyers and barristers in order for clients to feel like safe and represented. Sometimes her conviction when it came to the like sense of justice in the laws themselves took me aback a little bit, because she had like a real faith in the structures and the laws, and her suggestions were much more about diversity in representation rather than in changing laws, whereas I've encountered other texts which suggest that a lot of laws are unjust. In the vlog I filmed, I talked about the fact that stop and search has become something that's a lot more rampant in the UK since even this book came out, and that's legal but unjust. However, I still think it's a really excellent book, and it's not that surprising that as a barrister, she feels that the system needs change from within rather than changed itself, which I'm not necessarily saying is wrong. Like, she has a lot of experience and a lot of knowledge. I just think there's like wider discussions to be had based on like the different books I've read and the different perspectives I've read, but I still thought it was really educational, really eye-opening, and really, really important. I then more recently read 2 books for a vlog in which I read the books that my flatmate picked for me. So my wonderful flatmate and best friend Jill, who I recently moved in with, picked some books off of my TBR and encouraged me to read them, which I did. So those included another non-fiction book, which is Another Day in the Death of America by Gary Young. So this one deals with events across the pond from me here in Scotland over in America, in the United States specifically. And it's such an interesting concept because Gary Young is a journalist who grew up in Britain, but moved over to the US because his wife is American and they had their children there and they've raised their children there. And when he relocated there, he became much better and more well acquainted with the American gun culture. And as part of his research as a journalist, he learned that on average around 10 children every single day in the United States die because of gun violence. And that could be intentional homicides, it's sometimes accidental shootings, sometimes we don't actually know whether it was an accident or whether it was on purpose, sometimes it's lack of gun safety, sometimes it's gang related, sometimes it's random. And so he decided to pick a random day, specifically the 23rd of September in 2013, and look at the lives of the 10 young people that died due to gun violence on that day. And we get in-depth explorations of their death, the effects it had on their families, the day leading up to their death, and like the surrounding events, as well as who they were as people based on what he could learn. And it was such a sad and emotional book because it is just the story of these 10 lives lost so young, and it's so sad. And through that he does touch on issues of gun safety, on gun control, on gun culture, on societal attitudes to guns in the US, and much, much more. But it's more specifically focused on these individual cases than it is necessarily an examination of guns in all like walks of life in America. Like, he does talk about statistics and he does talk about gun control and he does talk about movements that are pro-gun and anti-gun in America, but that's like tangentially through this focus on these young people's lives. And it was just really sad and emotional. Like, what else could it possibly be? But it was really well written, and I think really important to hear these like individual stories. And then last but not least, for that reading vlog and for this video, I read Other Words for Smoke by Sarah Maria Griffin. So this is a paranormal, fantastical, dark mystery novel set in Ireland. I feel like it touches on a few different genres, but it's very, very beautifully written, and it's from the perspective of 3 different young people predominantly. There's a few other little perspectives occasionally like sprinkled in there, but these are the 3 main perspectives, which are May and Rossa, 2 twins, a brother and a sister, who go to spend the summer with their great aunt because their parents are fighting a lot and their marriage seems to be taking a nosedive. So they go to spend the summer with their aunt, who basically has this lodger who's another teenage girl a couple years older than them that used to live in their great aunt's house with her mother, but her mother went off and left her. So now it's just their great aunt and this older girl, Bevan. So their aunt is a witch, she practices tarot, she practices herbal magic, but there is something much more insidious and dark in the house, a presence to which Bevan is communicating, and we don't exactly know what or who this presence is that is haunting this house, or what it wants from Bevan or from the twins or from their great aunt, but you gradually come to learn that through the story. And it was a really beautiful unwinding of events, dark events, both in their great aunt's life, in their life, in their parents' lives, in Bevan's life, and how all these like sad events, how all of these traumas and griefs coalesce almost in a tangible way, and something dark rises out of it. And I did love, love, love the writing in this book. I definitely want to check out more by Sarah Maria Griffin in the future. I couldn't quite decide whether I would categorise this as YA or adult, because although I picked up in the adult section of the bookshop, it does have predominantly teenage characters who also are struggling with a lot of the issues that I think face young people, like coming to terms with sexuality and first loves and first crushes and being manipulated, and really experiencing that time in life which is quite unique, your teenage years. You both feel so old yet you are so young simultaneously, and it felt like thematically it dealt with a lot of things the young adults experience, which is why, although it maybe is written as an adult novel, I think young adults would really, really enjoy it as well. There is also, like I briefly mentioned, there's some queer sapphic rep, which is fantastic, and overall really, really atmospheric and enjoyable. And that brings me to the end of this video. Some really good books this month and last month. I hope you enjoyed hearing about them. I would love to hear from you if you've read any of them or are just interested in reading any of them. As always, love, love, love talking about these books with you. It's what makes filming these videos so enjoyable. So yeah, thanks for watching, and until next time, happy reading. I'll see you all again soon. Bye everyone.